Foreign policy requires a fine balancing act. India has had a long history of that non-aligned movement. But many observers have noted that India's growing proximity with the West in the past 10 to 15 years, through nuclear deals, through groupings like Quad. Now, the Prime Minister's Moscow visit seems to be a reminder that old friendships cannot be just set aside. It cannot be easily replaced. At least that's what it's indicating. But this visit is especially tricky. Russia continues to assault Ukraine. Meanwhile, India has to balance economic interests in what is a deeply divided world. Not surprisingly, this visit comes under attack from the Ukrainian President Zelensky himself, also from critics of the government back home. In the next half an hour, we're going to discuss this at length. We'll tell you what India has gained from this visit of Prime Minister Modi to Moscow and why the Prime Minister's statements are being keenly watched across the globe. Listen in to what he said in his addresses during his visit to Russia so far.
ये रिश्ता म्यूचुअल ट्रस्ट और म्यूचुअल रिस्पेक्ट की मजबूत नींव पर बना है। और वो गाना तो यहां के घर घर में कभी गाया जाता था, सर पे लाल टोपी रूसी, फिर भी ये गीत भले ही पुराना हो गया हो, लेकिन सेंटिमेंट्स एवरग्रीन है। भारत रूस मित्रता के कारण जब दुनिया फूड, फ्यूल एंड फर्टिलाइजर के संकट से गुजर रही थी, हमारी मित्रता और हमारे सहयोग के कारण मैं मेरे देश के किसानों को फर्टिलाइजर में मुसीबत में नहीं आने दिया। फर्टिलाइजर की उनकी जो आवश्यकता है उसकी पूरी करने में हम सफल रहे। आपके सहयोग के कारण भारत में हम सामान्य नागरिक को पेट्रोल, डीजल की आवश्यकताओं में कठिनाइयों से हम बचा पाए। पीढ़ी के उज्जवल भविष्य के लिए शांति सर्वाधिक आवश्यक है, लेकिन मैं ये भी जानता हूं कि युद्ध के मैदान में समाधान संभव नहीं होते। बम, बंदूक और गोलियों के बीच समाधान और शांति वार्ताएं सफल नहीं होती हैं और हमने वार्ता के माध्यम से ही शांति के रास्ते अपनाने होंगे।
Well, one may infer that what the Prime Minister is doing in this Moscow visit is to strike a neat balancing act. How successful is he in being able to do that? We'll discuss this with our guests, but let's just try and understand this from our reporters who've been tracking this very keenly. Srinjoy Chaudhary is part of the Times Network and he's on that Moscow visit as well. My colleague and co-anchor here on India Tonight, Sumita Kareer, joining us from our Delhi studios to discuss what we are hearing from the Foreign Secretary as well. But let me come to you first, Srinjoy. As far as this visit is concerned, on one hand, the Prime Minister has praised the ties between India and Russia. On the other hand, he's clearly stated that peace is of paramount importance for future generations in a clear reference to the ongoing war in Ukraine. How do we perceive this balancing act that India is trying to strike through this visit of the Prime Minister to Moscow?
Well, a lot of people will call it balancing, but both are right, because Indo-Russian ties are very important. You look at India's defense equipment, even 60% of it, whether it's tanks, armored personnel carriers, warships, submarines, S-400 air defense systems, they're all Russian. Now, you need spares, you need maintenance, and that can only come largely from Russia. So India and Russia have something going there. As far as the space program is concerned, again, though the Americans are now offering things, and that will happen too, the Russians have been helping India with the space program for years and years, beginning with Rakesh Sharma and all that. Now, even for this Gaganayan, this manned mission, the Russians have been helping with the engines and also with the training. So in areas like civil nuclear, trade, defense, of course, all these areas, the Russians and Indians have been very close. And it has to be said that both sides realize that Russia is exporting much more than India is exporting to Russia, and that has to change. So that too is on the anvil. Besides that, yes, you talked about peace. Prime Minister has always been very clear about this. The Indian position is that we have to have peace. The war between Russia and Ukraine has to end. And the earlier it ends, the better it is for not only India, for not just South countries, but also the world. Very importantly, Prime Minister had said several years ago that the 21st century is not a time for war. And today, in Russia, with Vladimir Putin in attendance, he spoke about the need for peace.
Indeed. So this balancing act between economics, Srinjoy, and of course, as far as diplomacy is concerned, considering that India has positioned itself as a country that is going to push for peace as far as the Ukrainian war is concerned. But economics, Sumita, is at the heart of it, one would imagine. And we've heard from the Foreign Secretary about this as well. Do decode for us what exactly the Foreign Secretary has said where economic engagement between India and Russia are concerned.
Yes, Vikram, very importantly, the economic engagement between the two countries, the Foreign Secretary said that was the focus of these talks. Of course, like my colleague Srinjoy Chaudhary was mentioning, that the Ukraine crisis, the Russia-Ukraine crisis did figure in these talks. And of course, the Prime Minister stating that the only way for lasting peace is through peaceful dialogue. And that was really appreciated by President Putin as well. But overall, it is the economic engagement that remained the focus, the core focus area of that bilateral, wherein both the sides spoke about trade, capital linkages, energy trade, of course, defense cooperation and expanding that, and of course, fertilizer security. In fact, the Prime Minister also spoke about expanding the Make in India, the manufacturing mission that India really has, that campaign, and how that can be expanded. On rebalancing of trade as well was one of the things that was discussed at present. The bilateral trade between both the countries stands at $65 billion, and both the sides are looking at expanding that to $100 billion target. And then, of course, India is also looking at greater market access in industrial and agriculture sector. But most importantly, both the sides agreed that economic cooperation till 2030 has to be expanded, and which is where I think that revised target of 100 billion really comes into the picture. Other than these, there was discussion on Kudankulam project, energy cooperation, security, stronger supply chains. These were some of the things that were discussed. But most importantly, farmers remained a key focus area this time as well, in light of the food, fuel and fertilizer crisis that India has been able to wade over due to this partnership.
Yes, indeed. Food, fuel and fertilizers, a very important kind of space as far as India is concerned, and thanking Russia for it this time during that visit also assumes a lot of significance. Indeed, Srinjoy and Sumita, thank you very much for putting that in context for the discussion that is about to follow. And for that, Sanjeev Srivastava joins us. He's a political commentator, along with former consulting editor of ET Now, Maroof Raza, who's a defense analyst, also on the show with us, and former ambassador to Jordan, Libya and Malta. Anil Trigunayat is with us on this discussion here on ET Now. Great to have you, gentlemen, as always. You know, I want to begin by asking all three of you, under Modi 3.0, we've seen the Prime Minister in Italy hug the Ukrainian President Zelensky. This happened in Italy at the G7 summit. And now in Moscow, the Prime Minister has given just as warm a hug to President Putin. Is this the fine balancing act that it is supposed to be, in your opinion? Is it about diplomacy? Is it about good economics? Coming to you first, Sanjeev.
See, I think the ambassador would be the best person to answer that. But diplomacy is your own national interest. Foreign policy is guided by India's interest. And for that, on some forum, you have to hug the Ukrainian president, the US leadership, the European leadership. And if you're in Moscow, you are reaching out for Mr. Putin. And like Srinjoy and your other colleague were just elaborating in some detail, that India-Russia relationship is like really time-tested. though we are facing many challenges right now, the one thing which has not been talked about so far, which I'm sure my fellow panelists will be in a great position to throw more light on, is the new dragon in the room, which is China. So apart from all this fuel, economics, trade balance, West versus Russia, and in between India finds itself, the other dynamics which is playing out is how Russia is getting increasingly not just close, but dependent on China. And Putin was there in only last week, meeting the Chinese top leadership. So there are so many elements to this relationship, but will continue the discussion. But like Srinjoy mentioned in great detail, how our complete defense preparedness is so much dependent on Russia that it has to be a continuing fine balancing act.
Well, indeed, whether or not this is a fine balancing act, I would definitely want to ask Ambassador Trigunayat as well. In your opinion, how well has India done in finding that balance?
Well, I think that from the very beginning of this war, if we were to talk about it, India's position has been very clear. India has always said from the very first time in the UN that there should be dialogue, diplomacy, and the peace. That is what should resolve the crises. And that this UN Charter, that means territorial integrity and sovereignty, must be respected. So that has been very clear, consistent, principled step. Now you may term it as balancing act or whatever it is, but that's not the case really. That's how I don't think that the Indian policymakers think that way. And as far as Prime Minister's visit to Moscow is concerned, I think it was very timely, and I'm happy that this decision was taken by him. Now, this is full of symbolism, no doubt. He also got this highest order of Russia, which is very unique. He has been, of course, honored by many countries in the world. That shows the kind of heft he brings onto the diplomatic table. And it is marked by tremendous substance as well. And as was mentioned by others, that there is so much meat in the relationship that's not going anywhere. And then it's a special status, and we call it a special privileged strategic partnership. And I know that when I was in Moscow in 2001, then when we started off these annual summits, so for some reason, for 2, 3 years, we didn't have that. Now it was time to catch up. So therefore, this is, and it also underlines the strength of the relationship, as well as you mentioned, trust and time tested. And that's very much so. I mean, historically, otherwise, today, and when Prime Minister talked about the 3 Fs and whatnot, I mean, those are the real issues. Every country has to cater for its own requirements first. And that's what precisely done by India during this time. Now, President Zelensky scoffing at it, I think is one a poor taste, basically, because he is the one who has been chasing us. He has been telling India to play a role in bringing about some kind of thing. Does he expect that India also should be part of the American bloc, whereby condemning just the Russia and leading nowhere? Today, Prime Minister Modi, on the face of President Putin, can tell him, number one, this is not an era of war. He can also tell him that the peace is the only way out. And he said that I'm hopeful after talking to President Putin that he's interested in peace. Now, instead of talking of peace, the other side is only talking of war. Now, there are going to be maximalist positions from both sides. But those maximalist positions at the negotiating table come to a decent or some kind of an understanding between the two countries. Russia does not see whatever is happening there by NATO or others, or it's a war with Ukraine. It sees its war with the West. So we have to look at it in a rather...
So not to get aligned with the Western bloc as far as its stance against Russia is concerned vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine at this point in time, I want to ask you, Maroof Raza, how well is India doing? Because like both your fellow panelists are saying, it's a time-tested relationship between India and Russia. At this time, when you see that kind of warmth still emerge in the kind of bonhomie that both leaders seem to be showing, what is your takeaway? Because a lot has changed since we've had dealings with the Soviet bloc. Today, in light of what's happening in Ukraine and India's own interests when it comes to defense, where do things stand from this kind of visit that the Prime Minister has made at this time?
You see, India's stand has disappointed the West. Nobody's in doubt about that. And the fact that the very matured response of the Modi government 2.0 and now 3.0, which is more a follow-up on the earlier policies, has really stumped people like Mr. Zelensky, who has capitalized and maximalized the entire Western anger against Mr. Putin. Clearly, America's initiatives against Russia have had at best a 50-50 success and failure ratio. They have failed to cripple the Russian economy. People say that India has helped the Russians out, but actually by taking in so much of oil from Russia, India has helped the global economy, because if we hadn't, and there was more demand for oil from the Middle East, our traditional suppliers, oil today would not be at $75 to $80 a barrel. It would be $125 to $150 a barrel. Who would end up paying those bills? Already the Europeans and the Americans are not being able to cope with all the pressure on their economy, whether it comes from the shortage of fuel from the Russian end and the shortage of other products that Russia makes. Like, for example, a number of cars and variants that Europe imports used to get from Russia, but now they're not able to get that at that cheap rate. As far as India is concerned, we have to very clearly let the world know that the world was not anymore going to be divided into a Russian camp and an American camp, and the Europeans wagging their tail behind the Americans.
Right.
But the camps are going to be also led by India, which, as we know, is now the de facto leader of the G20 countries of the South.
Yes.
And this is an important aspect that the world has to factor in. The one area that I'm disappointed with India's approach to the Ukraine conflict is that we could have played a more aggressive peacemaker. Here is a chance that we have to shed the mental baggage of wanting to mediate, but the fear that others would want to mediate in Kashmir.
Right.
They can try, but they can't achieve much with India on the Kashmir front.
Right.
I mean, I can say with my hand on heart that we tick all the right boxes on the Kashmir issue.
Right.
As far as the world is concerned, they are looking for another country which carries credibility and respect to end the baggage of the conflict in Ukraine.
Correct.
India is liked by Washington, India is liked by Moscow,
Yes.
and India is generally seen
And-
as a good friend to have by
And at
everybody.
this
I
point
think
in
Mr.
time,
Modi is
we're talking
capitalizing
about
on
that balancing act where India wants to kind of do business with the entire world. Wherever there is a possibility, wherever there is an opportunity, India wants to kind of gain from any such opportunities that exist. And we are seeing that in evidence. Ambassador Trigunayat, as far as India's push to be able to get more economics at the heart of these discussions and playing a larger role in trying to bring peace in an ongoing war where there is no end, how much more aggression do you think India should have in trying to play that role at this point in time? Because already we are seeing it being positioned as the voice of the global South. Is there a bigger opportunity that one needs to see getting pushed even further?
Well, I think as far as India is concerned, it has very clear stacks of priorities. The first priority is to ensure that we have the long-term supply of crude as well as the fertilizers. 30% of fertilizers are coming from Russia, and nearly 2 million barrels a day we are getting in from Moscow also. Now there has to be an expansion of that. I believe that there are going to be greater focus on our economic opportunities in the Far East during this visit, which was the last visit of Prime Minister Modi in 2019. As a global South, India has been pushing, and Prime Minister has very clearly mentioned that the world is suffering out of this war and war must end. And he said that the guns and bombs do not get the solve problems. And so therefore, India has to, today, I think this is precisely what Prime Minister is doing when he's conferring, first after conferring with Zelensky, promising him that we'll do whatever we can. And we have said it many times that both sides need to be ready. And this particular discussion, I think, would have led to a better understanding and appreciation of where does Russia stand in this whole thing? How does it proceed? Because in today's time and age, it is not easy for any country to mediate or be an interlocutor. But an honest interlocutor, as Maroof said, is the only country, India is the only country today that can play that role between both sides. So that's why I was a bit surprised by an irresponsible statement of Mr. Zelensky.
Let me take that across because back home as well, Jairam Ramesh's tweet, I was looking at Sanjeev, it says that self-styled Vishwaguru, who also gave himself the title of Vishwa Bandhu, is in Moscow the day a children's hospital in Ukraine is bombed. He asks, what happened to the Ukraine mein war rukwadi boast? Do tell us, as far as the kind of push that India is making to kind of getting much more out of its strongest relations, this time in the context of Russia, in trying to look for opportunities elsewhere. As far as the opposition and resurgent opposition in Modi 3.0's time, is this something that the government will have to play defensive on?
See, I'm a little old-fashioned and conservative on that front. I don't subscribe to Jairam Ramesh's comment on this. Yes, it is a bit of an embarrassment that the day Mr. Modi is there is an attack or airstrike in Ukraine, and there are reports about some children's hospital also getting under the crossfire and the death of some children. So that's very unfortunate, and that's a little bit of an embarrassment for the Indian Prime Minister. But to really comment it like this, foreign policy and defense affairs were largely seen for, or at least the last 30-35 years that I have put in journalism, was seen as consensus between opposition and ruling party. So last 5-7 years, we have seen all consensus broken as far as the political landscape is concerned between the ruling party and opposition. But here, Mr. Ramesh it would have been nicer, at least from my point of view. But he has said what he had to say. Now, this issue about resolving the conflict, I think the ambassador said, put it right. Also, Maroof, my very dear friend, when he said that India could have played a more aggressive or a more proactive role. But it's easier said than done also, we know. Because both sides, the position right now is so hard. Russia just does, and Russia very rightly does not want NATO anywhere near its borders. And Ukraine was pushing for it, and they saw it as a threat to themselves, and they invaded Ukraine, if you may. And which by itself is very wrong. How can you invade any country in today's time? And so both sides have their point, and like the ambassador said, in today's time, it's best that the both countries only come together somewhere. And yes,
so you're not seeing a role for India as an interlocutor.
Yeah, act like an honest broker. At least make them reach the table, if you may. The decision and the hard bargaining will have to be done by them only.
Right.
At best, somebody can play an honest broker or a messenger. But I won't really. I started by saying that, and since none of my fellow panelists have commented on that,
yes,
the only worry I have on India-Russia relationship, one is that how will this trade balance be restored? Because whether it's fertilizers, whether it's defense equipment and spares, whether it's fuel, it's so heavily tilted in favor of Moscow, and we have to import all these things.
Correct.
So none of these things is going away. So
right.
What is it that we will offer?
Let me take that across.
And the issue of China.
Right. Because let me take both of these points across. You have very valid points. Though we are running out of time, I want to... Yes. I think both of these are very valid points. Both China and this kind of trade imbalance, like you're pointing out. Let me ask Maroof first. As far as China is concerned, like Sanjeev pointed out, it's the big dragon in the room. How do you think that is going to get mitigated as we see these ties between India and Russia become stronger through this visit?
See, China is not going away from any equation, whether India-Washington or India-Moscow or even India-Pakistan or the other Arab countries. China is everywhere. Its shadow is going to grow more and more. The fact of the matter is, instead of trying to hope that Russia or America are going to twist China's tail and get them to fall in line, make yourself stronger, assertive, and make yourself put kind of fear into China that their agenda for Vision 2050 is not going to be fulfilled if India continues to progress. And the one way that India can progress technologically, that without bargains built into it, is to pull out of Russia whatever. So, the good point that Sanjeev has made and others are making, how do you balance it? You balance it by getting more Russian technology, you giving things to Russia, which Russia needs desperately. And one of the things that India can provide to Russia is the capabilities of the Indian IT sector.
Right.
India
But
has
why has that not
the
happened yet? We've had
well,
ties for a very long time. India has always looked for
I'll
opportunities.
blame
Yes.
I'll blame the colleagues of the good ambassador for lack of foresight on that.
Let me ask Ambassador Trigunayat, where is the push missing to find a better balance in trade relations between the two countries? Ambassador.
Well, as you know, that the trade used to be about $10 billion, which are nearly balanced. Today, also, your exports from India is about $4 billion. The skew trade that we are looking at is because of the crude that we've been importing for about $60 billion in that.
Right.
Besides, we also the nuclear reactors and others. So that's a trade equivalence that is missing. But as Maroof said rightly, we have many things that we can go now. And I think that this is precisely what is going to be signed today. Those are the kind of agreements which will be signed, how we can go ahead. Doing that, whether it is in pharma, whether having designated companies which will be doing trade. And now today, the problem has been the sanctions. Most of these IT companies in India are also working in the United States and elsewhere. So many of the private companies are worried about that they might come under sanctions. So we have to create some kind of a special purpose vehicles which can deal and avoid these kind of unilateral sanctions. So that's one. Secondly, the question of China, as Sanjeev asked, I fully agree with what Maroof has said. But at the same time, in my view, the thing is that Russia needs China today to counter the West. But if you know Russia well, you know that it is one country that does not like to be subjugated by another country. So therefore, in order to counter China, eventually it will need India. And that's one reason the strength of our bilateral relationship has been there. I've been part of negotiations of the SCO where Russia pushed for India to be their part of it. And China continued to bring it that if you bring in India, Pakistan will have to come.
But
So we'll
Ambassador,
have to
how
see
much
in
of
that
the
way.
impact of how the West is going to perceive stronger bilateral trade ties between India and Russia is going to impact India's push towards getting more balance in trade?
Well, I think the balance in trade will be difficult in my view. Only thing is that the surplus Russia has a great opportunity today, provided it can afford it and it targets it. Because today that is surplus money, $60 billion or whatever continues to grow, can be invested in the Indian opportunity, whether it is in the defense sector, whether it is in the infrastructure or any other area. So it's quite possible that they will be doing that.
Right.
It's already they have started doing in the markets and elsewhere. So that's
Right.
the only way you can balance it. Trade cannot be balanced. And we have it with many countries, which are the oil producing and exporters to us, that we have a trade imbalance. With China, we have such a big trade imbalance.
Right. Meanwhile, we are looking at how the Indian diaspora has been addressed as well. And Sanjeev, this is for you because it's an important constituency for the Prime Minister. What did you hear in his address to the diaspora in Moscow that rang differently, considering it's the first time in his third consecutive stint as Prime Minister that he has spoken to the diaspora?
Are you playing out a clip or?
No, I am not, because you must have heard it, right?
Yeah, I did.
Yes.
I did. See, Indian diaspora plays a very important role in Mr. Modi's scheme of things, in his scheme of politics.
Exactly.
And that has been the case since 2014. Immediately after winning the election, he was in US and addressing a huge Indian gathering at Madison Square in New York. So, and since then there have been, Indian diaspora meetings at Wembley in London, again in US, and every country he goes to. So the diaspora forms actually a very strong support base of Mr. Modi and of the BJP, and they have become great ambassadors for the party and the BJP. I think that's something which we have all noticed over these last 10 years. And what the 2024 election has really shown, that the diaspora support is more unwavering and more there for Mr. Modi than parts of India. So, but which is fine. Those things keep changing, and who knows what future has in store. But Mr. Modi has used the diaspora very tactfully. He has addressed them well. After all, they are people of Indian origin abroad. So reaching out to them, getting them to invest back in India, or at least acting like ambassadors for India across the world, that's a very important
Yes, and
work
that
that he
keeps
has
recurring.
done. And to instill some sense of pride,
Yes.
which everybody talks about these last few years, that how the Indian passport has gained
Correct.
more traction.
Correct.
And a little bit it's more respectable than it was earlier.
But Sanjeev, also the other constituency that seems to have been addressed very consistently since Modi 3.0 has happened is the farmer community. And there has been thanks to Russia for supporting the farmers with food, fuel and fertilizers. That has been at the center stage and even in this Moscow visit.
Yeah. Actually, the Prime Minister, I'm sorry, Vikram, he did mention about that. I forgot to mention that.
Yes.
That's an important constituency. But I would frankly, the ink is not still dry. It's just 35 days since Modi 3.0 has begun.
Yes.
So, yes, farmers is a huge constituency and it will be a huge constituency going forward, especially with the string of assembly elections now round the corner later this year. So those are areas which he'll have to focus on. But I think it's more than politics.
Right.
When he's going overseas for such bilateral visits, he's trying to get the best deal for India.
Well, how far he goes in getting the best deal for India is going to be something that we are watching very closely, because what follows after, whether it's a Make in India mission, whether it's about getting the requisite energy, whether it's through oil, whether it's through civil nuclear trade, and what happens with the space mission as well, all of it is in play because these ties, as we've all discussed, run very deep with Russia. And in the current context, in the geopolitics of now, with the Ukrainian war, what has happened after COVID and these kind of conflicts that have taken place, there is a major shift taking place. And India trying to find that balancing act is an important piece at this stage. We are watching it and we are getting all the feedback and all the decoding that we do with experts like you. Sanjeev Srivastava, Maroof Raza, Anil Trigunayat. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us on this discussion here on this edition of India Tonight. Pleasure having you on the show.